Hello folks, and welcome back to my channel. Today I would like to talk a little bit about nipple piercings and estrogen, specifically for my trans women, my trans feminine, and my non-binary followers. This seems like the logical follow-up to a lot of the trans masculine content I've done surrounding nipple piercings and binding and testosterone, so let's get into the other side of things. Nipple piercings when it comes to estrogen. What do you need to know? Well, to start, let's talk about the effects that estrogen as a hormone has on the nipples. Estrogen causes breast and nipple development, which can absolutely affect getting nipple piercings. You're basically going through a second puberty where you're growing breasts for the first time, and this comes along with all of the changes of puberty as well. Now, breasts grow in multiple different stages. Usually the breast buds grow first, and we just see some changes to the area directly around the nipple itself. The nipple may become more raised, more protrusive, more puffy. The areola may widen and change in color. Once there's some bud development, then the breast itself begins to develop. We begin to see an increase of fatty tissue around that area. Glandular breast tissue starts to come in. The breasts start to fill out. We can also see further changes to the nipple during this stage as well. And then from there, the breasts just continue to develop, continue to grow, continue to fill in. Now, this information is pulled from timeline data for an estrogen-fueled initial puberty when someone is in their young teens. There is, unfortunately, like a real lack of clinical data about estrogen-fueled breast growth when it comes to transgender folks. There's some data out there, there definitely is, but it's not nearly as comprehensive or as helpful as I would have liked it to be when I was sitting down and researching for this video. Even with that lack of clinical data about timelines and changes, 3 to 9 months for initial changes and 2 to 4 years for overall changes seems to be like an agreed upon length of time. So these are the time periods during which your breasts, your nipples, they're really changing, they're really developing. Most initial growth probably going to happen in that first year, but full growth and final changes aren't going to settle into year 2 to 4. Now, some piercers really prefer to take a completely conservative approach and don't suggest doing nipple piercings until you're past that 4-year mark, just because there's so many changes going on in the breast tissue. This is not an entirely off-base thought process to have. I am not necessarily this strict with it. I usually suggest folks wait around 1 to 2 years before considering piercings, but I'll even sometimes do piercings a little sooner based off the benefit that it'll provide to the client. I'm going to get into a detailed breakdown of timelines later in this video, but first let's talk about how these changes actually affect your piercings and what the risks and concerns are that we're talking about when we're discussing timeframes. Now, obviously, this part of our body is changing a lot. Some of the different changes that can occur are growth of the nipple, changing of size, changing of shape, changing of protrusion. The skin texture itself can change, the skin color can change. Basically, just about everything about your nipple as it exists now could potentially be completely different in 1 to 2 years. Doing a piercing when we know that we are going to be going through so many bodily changes that are so extreme in some cases comes with a really high risk. Things like migration, rejection, severe scarring, severe issues with the healing process, the piercing just really never fully healing, are all things that can result from getting pierced too soon on estrogen and experiencing these changes to the area. Possibly some of the biggest concerns when we talk about piercing very early on during breast development is migration, rejection, and hammerhead scarring. Migration is when a piercing begins to migrate into a different position. Sometimes this means migrating straight forward and eventually rejecting or growing completely out of the body, but it can also mean migrating to sit at a different angle, migrating to sit at a different depth. There's lots of ways piercings can migrate. And when we have either existing nipple piercings and we decide to start estrogen, or we decide to get pierced very early on in estrogen, migration as your nipple is growing and changing is definitely a concern. Again, your entire nipple is growing and changing. There is no guarantee that your piercing is going to grow with it the way you want it to. So that is a really big concern. So is rejection. I've definitely seen clients who had existing nipple piercings that were decades healed and totally healthy and happy, start estrogen, have some very big breast and nipple changes very early on, and their body just went, nope, and pushed those piercings right clean out of them. If you catch it early, you can remove the piercings and typically really minimize scarring, but some clients don't catch or notice the signs of it right away. Sometimes it can happen pretty rapidly with being on estrogen, and if you let it go too far too quickly, you will just end up with it splitting the nipple. It can leave some really serious scarring. It can result in potentially even needing surgery to repair things, so it is no joke. And then hammerhead scarring. Hammerhead scarring is a type of scar tissue that is unique to nipple piercings. We see it primarily with nipples on chests, but we can see it on all bodies. And it is these unique growths of bulbous scar tissue, kind of like this, on either side of the nipple piercing. And it gets its name because it kind of resembles a hammerhead shark. This scarring is especially prevalent in nipple piercings on chests, usually when they're done too deep or done through the areola, but I do often see this scarring begin to form on clients who either had existing piercings before starting estrogen or who got pierced too early on estrogen and had issues. I see it the most in clients who got pierced too soon, typically like just a couple of months into being on estrogen. As their body was changing and growing from this, the tissue and the scar tissue that was forming around their piercings just kind of went wild, and we ended up with hammerhead scars. These scars are permanent. The only thing that can correct them is surgery, and I believe some heavy modification artists have done some successful hammerhead scar corrections. I don't know that I've ever seen like an actual plastic surgeon do a hammerhead scar correction, or one that looked frankly very good. So this is potentially very permanent scarring. Some people are not bothered at all by the look of hammerhead scarring. Some people even like how it looks. Some people go into getting pierced intending to try and get that scarring. So if that's you, awesome, hell yeah, I'm here for it. But plenty of people don't like this scarring and would not like to have this happen to their body. And it is a real risk that should be discussed when we are talking about nipple piercings and estrogen. This type of scar tissue can definitely occur. Those are kind of the more serious risks. Some of the lower key risks are just piercings never really healing, dealing with irritation bumps on and off, dealing with a lot of excess swelling, especially as the nipples and breasts are growing. That tissue is literally growing and getting larger, so jewelry can overswell and embed pretty easily, and sometimes kind of at a moment's notice. A lot of clients will have like jewelry that is perfect, has room on it, looks great, and will simply wake up the next morning with very sore, very swollen looking breasts. They're like really excited about how things look in the mirror, but their piercings, not excited, not having a good time. So there's also just some general concerns with healing being more difficult, more prolonged. Now, I see these concerns drop way off when we pierce after the 2-year mark of being on estrogen. The tissue tends to be a little bit more stable. You're closer to what your final size for your nipples will be. Obviously, some people still develop breasts well into years being on estrogen, but for the most part, I tend to see that tissue pretty well stabilized at the 2-year mark. That tends to be our magic window to do these piercings in. That being said, 2 years is a really long time to wait for some folks, and some folks find that the gender affirmation that they would get from doing these piercings earlier on is more than worth the risks of doing them too early. Me personally, under 1 year, I will simply decline to pierce. I have just seen way too many issues specifically with that hammerhead scarring, and I have seen that scarring cause issues for people with top surgery down the line. I personally don't want to be responsible for causing those types of permanent issues to a client, so my hard boundary is 1 year. I'm really going to encourage people to try and wait too, but if you sit me down and you're like, Lynn, the gender affirmation I would get from these piercings would be life-changing. I really feel like it's going to help my mental health. I really feel like it's going to help my relationship with my body. If you are willing and consenting to all of the risks that come with us doing it that soon, I'm down to do it after 1 year. I see less issues in that time frame. I still see them, which is why 2 years is personally my preference. And again, there are some piercers out there who are really strict and are going to put you at 4 years. I don't necessarily feel the need to be that strict because as a trans piercer, like, I fucking get it. I understand. It is tough to have to wait so long to get these things done that are really important for you, and we can usually manage after the 2-year mark. The risks are still there, but they're pretty decreased. Now, what does actually getting your nipples pierced while you're on estrogen look like? Well, it's going to vary with different piercers, but what it looks like with me is to start basic jewelry. I know I am once again breaking everyone's hearts. We are not starting with gemstones, we are not starting with opals, we are not starting with fancy decorative stuff, we are starting with plain titanium barbells. We can anodize them a pretty color for you if you'd like, but that is all we are doing. And that is because whether you have been on estrogen for 2 years, whether you've been on it for 20 years, estrogen-affected breast and nipple tissue is just very sensitive, very persnickety, and very unpredictable. And I don't want to risk these having some of those serious issues over starting with something fancier or cuter or more fun. So basic jewelry is going to be the easiest to pierce with, easiest to heal with. It's going to be the simplest to keep clean. It's going to be the easiest for monitoring. And if we need to change out different size jewelry, which is so common with these while they're healing, it's also going to be your most affordable option. So I'd way rather you start with something simple and easy to heal with, get these fully healed, then we can worry about different jewelry. Now, speaking of needing to change jewelry on these often, the biggest thing that I have my clients do when it comes to getting nipple piercings on estrogen is we do weekly virtual follow-ups. They can be done directly with me, or the client can kind of do them themselves, but every single week I have my clients take a picture of their nipples just from the front and then from the top. I try and have them do it in the same lighting, usually in their bathroom, every single week, and they can either keep those pictures in a folder on their phone, put them in a Google Drive folder, store them however they want, but weekly pictures. And the reason why I do this is because, again, migration is really common with these types of nipple piercings, rejection is really common, overswelling is really common, especially as the breasts are still growing and enlarging, things are changing. And so when we do this, we have picture documentation of how those piercings were sitting and also how the tissue was sitting throughout the entirety of the healing process. And this sometimes becomes literally game-changing when it comes to troubleshooting these and making them actually successful. So when we can go back and look at how they looked when they were first pierced, to how they're looking now, to how they look when they have problems, we can start to ascertain a lot of things. So for example, I had a very good regular of mine, about 1 year in on estrogen, really knew she wanted to get these pierced. We discussed all the risks. She said, okay, I'm comfortable with them. We did the piercings. We started tracking and logging. About 5 months into having them, she started having some issues, and I was like, okay, I don't want this to become serious. Let's go back through your log of all your photos. And in looking at the photos, I was able to tell her areola had started to change color. It started to get a little bit darker, and it started to get a little bit puffier. And this was all coinciding within about 3 weeks of when the piercing started to get really irritated. So I was like, okay, I think we're going through some breast changes. Let's swap you to some slightly longer jewelry, change up our aftercare, do some warm compresses to kind of help soothe the breast tissue. Sure enough, 3 weeks passed when we started adjusting our aftercare. She went and saw her doctor for her regular follow-up, and her breasts had grown quite a bit. She was going through another breast growth spurt, and we were able to ascertain that, kind of informed by the piercing having irritation and issues, but also because we had these photos to kind of document the changes her body was going through. Had I not had those photos, my first instinct at a piercer may have been to look at other factors. Are you sleeping on them? Is the bra you're wearing for them incorrect? Is something catching or snagging them at work? And we might have wasted weeks trying to troubleshoot things that ended up not being the cause of the issue and not get ahead of these having problems. In other instances, I've had clients who I've encouraged to do this who had existing piercings before starting estrogen, and they came to me and they were like, I'm going to start estrogen, I'm going to grow boobs, like what do I do with my nipple piercings? And I was like, well, take these weekly pictures, keep them somewhere. If you start having issues, come back in and see me. I must have lengthened her nipple barbells like 8 different times in her first year on estrogen because she got a lot of nipple bud growth, she got a lot of breast growth very, very quickly. And as things were growing, the jewelry became too tight and wasn't fitting anymore. And having this like photo log to go back through and see how things were growing, where the fat was filling in, how things were changing, really helped me make informed decisions about how we sized jewelry and what jewelry we went with. We were actually able to notice through these photos that right around like a couple months in, the angles of her piercings started shifting to this downward angle on the outsides as her breasts were filling in much more along that outer area. And we were adjusting our jewelry accordingly for these changes, We also adjusted the types of bras she was wearing because of these changes. And I'm happy to report that she still has her piercings to this day, and I don't know if we would have been so successful getting those to stabilize and stay if we hadn't had those photos to refer back to. So that picture taking and picture log is a huge part of the aftercare when we do these type of nipple piercings. It provides a lot of integral information for troubleshooting, for healing. It's also just kind of a nice log to have for yourself, especially if you end up dealing with migration. We can kind of track that migration and kind of plan ahead for it, adjust clothing for it. It's just a really, really useful tool. So anytime I do nipple piercings for clients on estrogen, these photos are like a big part of the aftercare. Other than that, I do sometimes tweak different aftercare, different bras, different clothing. That is all going to be super individual based on the client. I wish I could just come on here and be like, this is the secret aftercare that's going to heal your nipples if you're on estrogen. This is the secret bra that's going to be fine for your nipples if you're on estrogen. It doesn't exist. The aftercare that I give and the clothing suggestions that I make are really individually tailored to each client, their bodies, their anatomy, their lifestyle, what they do for work. There's so many different factors that go into it. The takeaway from that is to work with a really experienced piercer who has a lot of understanding and experience working with trans clients and the trans community, who understands what's going on with trans bodies when we're taking hormones and we're doing these things, and is educated and informed enough to work with you and make sure that these heal well. Overall, for healing time, I put these at 2 years. Traditionally, we put nipple piercings at 6 to 12 months, sometimes a little longer, because of all the changes that can occur with estrogen, because of how much is going on in that tissue. 2 years is just a much safer bet for me. You can have a lot of breast growth and a lot of breast change in 2 years, as we've already discussed in this video. So waiting 2 years before considering them healed and doing all the fun, funky stuff you want to do with them when they're healed is definitely the safer bet. And of course, it would be remiss of me to do this video without mentioning some stuff about breast forms and push-up bras. These two things can be very damaging for these piercings while they are still healing, or even if they're established piercings and you're just starting out on estrogen. With breast forms, it's a lot of compression on the area, and a lot of times they're like full silicone, and it gets pretty sweaty, pretty damp, pretty moist underneath there, and just not the best environment for piercings. And then with push-up bras, with inserts or cutlets, it's just a lot of pressure on the piercings. Cutlets and certain silicone inserts can also have kind of the same issues. So if you do those two things, I really, really encourage you to be super careful if you have existing piercings. I've had clients in the past who wear breast forms or inserts cut little holes into their inserts with a hot knife to like create a space for their nipple piercings. And I also am a really big fan of using nursing pads on the inside of bras and on the back side of like any silicone based insert cutlet breast form to just kind of absorb excess sweat and moisture and act as like a protective barrier for your piercings. If you do those things and you notice that when you take them off your piercings are sore, irritated, weepy, crusty, I know it sucks for me to be like, then don't do it, but I would hate to see your piercings migrate and reject over wearing these things. So please be really, really careful, and if you see those signs of irritation, give it a break, give your piercings time to recover. Being on estrogen is still totally compatible with getting your nipples pierced. I have done dozens of sets of nipple piercings for clients on estrogen. I've had a lot of them heal really beautifully. You can see some examples of them in the portfolio on my website. They are under the genital section because the internet hates boobs, and that is just the easiest way for me to store them safely without Google hating my website any more than it already does. So, and that's where you can find them on there. But I just wanted to make this video because I know a lot of folks have questions about this, and it is so not easy to find this information online. So if there's any other content, especially estrogen specific content that you'd like to see me cover, or any other questions that you have, please let me know in the comments down below. And thanks so much for letting me share some really cool, really important trans body piercing education with y'all tonight. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye!